Bienvenue to the first of our series of 3 Zoom lectures about Notre-Dame de Paris, before and after the fire. My name is Mary Ellen Kennellan, and I am the Executive Director of the Alliance Française de Chicago and a member of the Board of Directors of the Federation of Alliance Française USA. Today's lecture by Russell Kelley is about the construction and history of Notre-Dame up to the tragic fire on April 15th, 2019. It's been almost exactly 1 year since Notre-Dame reopened on December 7th, 2024, following the rebuilding and restoration of the cathedral in only 5 years after the fire. However, Notre-Dame is still very much in the news, first due to the ongoing restoration of the exterior of the cathedral that was not damaged by the fire, but suffered from the elements since its last restoration in the mid-19th century. It is also in the news due to the complete redesign of the area surrounding the cathedral, as will be discussed by the architects in charge of those 2 projects in the next 2 lectures in our Notre-Dame series. This event today is being hosted by the Federation of Alliance Française USA in partnership with the Alliance Française Miami Metro, the Alliance Française de Chicago, and the Friends of Notre-Dame, a 501c3 nonprofit organization raising funds to rebuild and restore Notre-Dame Cathedral. The Federation of Alliance Française USA is the largest network of Alliance Française chapters in the world, helping 26,000 students to learn French, live French, and love French. Please have a look at this wonderful short video. And there you have it. And also, we have some great national events coming up this month, in addition to the next 2 lectures in the Notre-Dame series. The first is a conversation with Dory Greenspan, who will tell us about her newest book, Dory's Anytime Cakes, on December 9th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And then a discussion about Richard Linklater's new film, Nouvelle Vague, with Peter de Bruges, Chief Film Critic of Variety, on December 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Please visit your local Alliance chapters for more information, or come directly to us at afusa.org. Now, a few logistics before we begin. Please stay on mute and speaker view during the presentation. Also, please put your questions in the chat room, and we'll get to them during the Q&A following Russell Kelley's presentation. If you have any technical issues, just sign out, sign in again with the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and you will receive a link to that channel following the presentation. The total runtime is approximately 1 hour. And now we are thrilled to introduce today's speaker and the curator of the series, Russell Kelley. Russell Kelley is a vice president of the Alliance Française Miami Metro and the author of The Making of Paris: How Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city, Lyon Press, 2021, and his latest book, Walking Through the Ages of Paris, 10 Historical Walking Tours Through the City of Light, to be published by Lyon Press in 2026. Russell has lived in Paris for over 30 years and next door to Notre-Dame for the last 20. Who better to talk to us on this subject? À vous, Russell.
Merci beaucoup, Mary Ellen, and bonjour tout le monde. I'm delighted to be coming to you today from Cambridge, Massachusetts, not sunny Florida. And as Mary Ellen said, we're going to be kicking off today a three-part series where we'll be talking next week about the restoration of Notre Dame after the fire, talk by Philippe Villeneuve en français. And because his talk will be en français, I'm going to be liberally sprinkling my presentation today with lots of good French vocabulary. And even though next week you will have the option to have captions translated simultaneously from French into English, some of those captions could be challenged, or some of those translations could be challenged for some architectural terms. So I'll be throwing a lot of those terms into my lecture. And the week after that, we have Bas Metz tell us about the redesign of the setting, the surroundings of Notre Dame. So my job today is to set the stage for those two presentations by telling you how the Cathedral of Notre Dame was first constructed and its history since the earliest days up until the fire.
Russell, thank you very much for the introduction. I just want to jump in and let you know that we see your notes as well as the slides. So it's not on full slide show mode at the
Well,
moment.
okay. Well, let me start again.
Perfect. Merci, Russell.
Okay, merci à toi, Melissa. So I'm going to talk to you about Notre Dame, the beating heart of Paris, le cœur battant de Paris. It's the largest church in Paris, and it's the second church built in the Gothic style. So what I plan to do today is to address these four subjects. What is the Gothic style of architecture? How was Notre Dame built? What has been the history of the cathedral and the parvis, the square in front of the cathedral, the surroundings of the cathedral, since the 12th century, right up until the tragic fire of April 15th, 2019. So the Gothic style replaced the Romanesque style, which means in the manner of the Romans. And the Romanesque style followed the Roman style. As you will recall, the Romans conquered Paris in 52 BC. Julius Caesar conquered France in 52 BC, and there began more than 500 years of Roman occupation of Gaul. So that was the Roman period. And after the Romans were turfed out by the Franks in 486 AD, that began the early Middle Ages period and the first early Romanesque period, since the Romans were no longer there, but still construction was in the style of the more Romans. That era came to an end at the end of the first millennium. The Vikings attacked Paris four times in the ninth century, and they laid waste to the city so that really nothing remains from the early Middle Ages, the 500 years that were the early Romanesque period, all having been destroyed. So where we pick up the story is in the High Middle Ages, the year 1000, and it'll take us through the late Middle Ages. The Gothic period will take us through the late Middle Ages, which ends in 1500. So that's 500 years that we'll be talking about when it comes to the construction of the cathedral, really. And it all starts, the modern era of Paris starts with Hugues Capet, the first French king, not Frankish king, the first of the Capetian dynasty. And he takes over when Paris is undergoing a huge surge in population. Paris, the entire left bank of Paris was abandoned basically because of Viking invasions, and people sought refuge on the island in the Seine, the Ile de la Cité. Population had only rebounded to 20,000 100 years after the Viking invasions, but it then surged to 110,000 by 1200 and double that by 1300, making Paris the largest city in Europe at that time. And Paris was surrounded by monasteries. You have at the top, you've got the temple and the Saint-Martin-des-Champs. At the bottom, you've got Saint-Victor. And on the left, you have Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Everything red there is either a cemetery if it's outside the city walls, or it's a church within the city walls, and some monasteries rather too. So the Romanesque style revived in Paris between 1000 roughly and roughly 1200 in the manner of the Romans, and is characterized by thick walls, small windows, rounded arches, and barrel vaults, exterior buttresses, and very simple decorations. So here you have an example of a Romanesque style church where you can see the nave is buttressed by side aisles, which are buttressed by buttresses. There's no transept, and the church is always pointed east. The first church, the first Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, was built by Constantine, and it was modeled on the Roman civic basilica. And this is where the Romanesque style comes from. And you can see here at the image on the top left, you've got a central nave with side aisles. And that became the standard form for Christian churches ever since. And all these churches, starting from the very first churches up until the Renaissance era or the Counter-Reformation, all churches Christian churches pointed east towards the sun, the light, representing the resurrection of Jesus. And all the entrances were on the west facade, where the sun set, darkness and death. And as a result, the sculpture of the Last Judgment was always over the central portal of the western facade. The age of Romanesque abbey churches, as I said, basically is the first 200 years of the second millennium, and it was followed by 300 years of the age of Gothic cathedrals and churches that took us through roughly 1500. So the Gothic style, despite its very dramatic name, was actually developed exclusively in, or primarily and originally in France, and it was known as the French work. Only at the very end of the Gothic period was the style referred to as Gothic by Italians, and it was in a disparaging manner because they did not like the Gothic style. They much preferred their new Italian Renaissance style. Nevertheless, the Gothic moniker stuck. And the plan for Gothic styles follows what you see before you, where you have a central nave, it is in yellow here, from left to right. Halfway down, or more than that, you get the transept, where there's the transept crossing, creating the shape of a cross. And on either side of the transept, you have side aisles. And at the eastern end, it's called an ambulatory. Now, for our French lesson here are the words that you will have to memorize. So you'll hear them a lot next week when Philippe Villeneuve talks about the restoration of Notre-Dame. So the nave is the nef, the transept, le transept, the crossing, la croisée, the choir, the chœur, the side aisles, the bas-côté, the ambulatory, the déambulatoire. So the French architect Le Corbusier defined the history of architecture as the history of the struggle for light. And when you're talking about the Gothic style of architecture, it's the struggle for light and height. And the brilliant achievements of the Gothic architects was to develop the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and flying buttresses to allow cathedrals to be higher with greater window and more larger windows and more light, as we will see. More vocabulary. You see what the flying buttresses are here, les arcs-boutants. The bottom right, you see what a pointed arch looks like, an arc brisé instead of rounded. It's got a pointed top. And the buttresses on the left are called contreforts. So what were the changes from the Romanesque style to the Gothic style? Well, I'm going to go through them one by one. Biggest change is that we move from rounded arches and barrel vaults to pointed arches and ribbed vaults. And what is the importance of that? Well, in the Romanesque style, barrel vaults exerted pressure evenly downward and outward along the entire length of the wall. So the walls had to be very thick in order to resist the downward and outward pressure. And they were never thick enough, so they were reinforced by buttresses. And because they had to be very thick, they could not be penetrated by large windows. Only small windows were possible. And the brilliant Gothic architects developed a new system of ribbed vaults whereby the arches transferred the weight directly to columns, and the ribs transferred the weight directly to vertical columns and not to the walls, not to the space between the columns. In the early Gothic style, it was a little more complicated, actually. They had a sexpartite vault over two bays, which were quite beautiful, but it resulted in an unequal distribution of weight on strong and weak pillars, which was less stable than the quadripartite rib vault, the much simpler rib vault, where you have two interlocking arches, in other words, four ribs over a single bay, which resulted in an equal distribution of weight on four identical pillars. And the advantage was that that allowed the ceilings to be higher. The next change from Romanesque to Gothic was the use of flying buttresses instead of exterior buttresses. And here you have examples of exterior buttresses, which are just literally against the outside of the wall in the lower case of in the lower part of this image of the side aisles of the Église Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, right next to Notre-Dame, and right against the nave at the top, and on the left at the right against the apse. So on the right here, you see a contrefort right against the side aisle, and above it, you have the flying buttresses that is only connected by a flyer from a pier to the wall, to the pillar, actually, in the upper clerestory of the nave. And this wonderful illustration shows you how the arrows demonstrate how the weight forced the pressure downward of the weight of the roof was forced downward and outward against the walls. And you can easily imagine that without these buttresses, the walls would just be forced outside. And thanks to the use of side aisles, buttresses, and flying buttresses, that pressure was counterbalanced, allowing the walls to be built higher and higher. Some more vocabulary. The arches or flyers spring from the wall to piers, buttresses or uprights, culettes, contreforts, with pinnacles, pinacle, which are installed on top of the piers for additional weight to make them even stronger to counterbalance the weight being transferred by the flying buttresses. Early Gothic flying buttresses were very simple, as you can see here on the Église Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. But they got much more complicated in the High Gothic period with much more decoration, including very highly decorated pinnacles, as shown around the chevet of Notre-Dame, And the use of these flying buttresses allowed thick walls to become thin with higher elevations. And critically, they allowed small windows to become very large. And as you can see in this image of the Reims Cathedral, all of the ribs from the vaulted ceiling above go to these pillars between the windows. So the entire space between the windows can now be used, between the pillars can now be used for windows, allowing the light in, which is the genius of the Gothic architecture. Another feature of Gothic architecture is that the inside decoration changed dramatically. And it became much more elaborate. On the left, you see the west facade of the Saint-Lazare-d'Autun Cathedral, and you can see it's quite simple in its architecture, very little decoration, only a tympanum above the central portal, whereas on the right side, the west facade of Notre-Dame, you can see it's got much more sculpture and decorations everywhere, including a rose window. In the Romanesque style, they had very small windows and those windows had clear glass because they needed all the light they could get. On the other hand, the interior was elaborately decorated, often with spectacular mosaics. Whereas with the Gothic style, the windows themselves became decorations with the invention of medieval stained glass windows, the best example of which is at the Chartres Cathedral, which has 152 of its original medieval stained glass windows still intact. They are spectacular. If you don't want to go an hour from Paris to Chartres, you can go a 5-minute, 10-minute walk from Notre-Dame to the Sainte-Chapelle, which was built in only 6 years by Louis IX, later Saint Louis, to house holy relics, which he acquired and built the chapel to house. And it is the epitome of the Rayonnant Gothic style. And the entire inside virtually is covered by spectacular stained glass windows. Go on a sunny day. And the Gothic style, as I said, spanned approximately 300 years, and it was not static, it changed. It evolved from the early Gothic with sexpartite rib vaults and 4-level elevations, which I will describe, to the High Gothic, where things were simplified. They went from sexpartite to quadripartite rib vaults and from 4-level to 3-level elevations. And then the Rayonnant or radiant Gothic period, where the rose window and bigger and larger windows came into fashion. And finally ended with the flamboyant Lake Gothic style, which is defined by the flame-like tracery around the window panes, particularly the rose windows, and more elaborate decoration. And Paris has lots of Gothic churches which demonstrate all of these styles. And Notre-Dame, which took 182 years to finish, started in the early Gothic style, and ended in the Rayonnant Gothic style. And so we have illustrations of 3 of the 4 styles of Gothic architecture at Notre-Dame. The very first church built in the Gothic style, therefore the new early Gothic style, is the Basilique de Saint-Denis, which is 6 miles north of Notre-Dame, definitely to be visited. And Notre-Dame was the second church built in the Gothic style. And that's what we'll now address, the construction of Notre-Dame. So Notre-Dame was built at the east end of the Ile de la Cité, in the middle of the Seine. And it replaced an earlier 6th century basilica called Saint-Étienne, St. Stephen's Basilica, that was just a little bit in front of Notre-Dame, as you can see here, which was built on the site of a Roman temple that was built during the Gallo-Roman period. So interesting to note that ever since 52 BC, there have been religious structures at the east end of Notre Dame. First Roman temples, then Romanesque basilicas, and now a Gothic cathedral. This is an imagination of what the Gothic cathedral, the Romanesque Saint-Étienne Basilica might have looked like. It might have looked like this as well, this wonderful Romanesque nave, which only dates back to 1000, but nevertheless, that gives you a very clear idea of what Romanesque churches look like. Once upon a time, you could see in front of the North Tower of Notre Dame paving stones which marked the outlines of the walls and aisles in St. Stephen's Cathedral, and a marker where the porch of the Basilica of St. Stephen Cathedral was be. Unfortunately, these were no longer visible in the current redesign of the parvis in front of Notre Dame. They were where the arrow is pointing. This photo is taken from the North Tower of Notre Dame before the fire. So how did Notre Dame get started? Maurice de Sully, the Bishop of Paris, laid the first stone in 1162. At that time, Paris was a diocese under the Archdiocese of Sens in Burgundy. And we will go through the construction of Notre Dame rather quickly. So the first, all churches are built basically from, not all, but most of the old churches were built from the east to the west. So this is a plan of Notre-Dame de Paris. And it shows it's not a classic church from its period, because it has a sexpartite vaults in the nave and choir and a double ambulatory. It started from the east, and the choir was built finished around 1177. And the choir was consecrated 5 years later, and a temporary wall was built next to the choir. So construction could continue with the transept and nave, but the choir could be used for religious services. This is by 1208, the transept had been finished, and the nave was under construction, again going from east to west. And here at 1220, the early Gothic nave had been completed, and the west facade was under construction. It was a 4-story elevation in the early Gothic style. And that means that starting from the bottom, there were 4 levels. You had the aisles on either side of the nave. Above that, the tribune or gallery. Above that, a very small gallery known as a triforium. And above that, the clerestory. And this is what it looks like in a real photo of the same cathedral, with the arcade, the tribune, the triforium, the clerestory, 4 levels. And the construction continued to the west facade. And it started in 1208. And finally, the whole facade plus the towers were finished in 1250. Here's the west facade with all of its many different levels. The west facade was a highly geometrically designed structure, and all these numbers had very significant religious signification. So the ratio, the width was 2 and the height was 3, 2 by 3. These are two magic numbers. 2 represents the duality of earth, the earthly realm represented by the square, and the heavenly realm represented by the circle. And the 3 represents the Holy Trinity, as represented by the 3 portals at the bottom level. And you can see just looking here, they're all at the very top. So you immediately see that the 3 are in different sizes. They were built at different times. In the center, the portal of the Last Judgment facing the setting sun, with the weighing of the souls, depending on whether you were going to go to the left to heaven or to the right to hell. The portal to the Virgin in the north portal to the left side. And next to that is the famous statue of Saint Saint-Denis, the first bishop of Paris, who was decapitated on Montmartre in 270. And as legend has it, carried his head 6 miles northeast to Saint-Denis, to the town now known as Saint-Denis, where he dropped dead. And that is where the first sepulchre was built, and ultimately the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the first Gothic church, was built. And Saint-Denis is the patron saint of France. And on the south side is the portal of Notre-Dame, is the portal of Sainte Anne, the mother of Marie. And you can see here that this tympanum above the portal is in a Romanesque style of architecture, and it doesn't quite fit into the broken arch above it. And it turns out that that is because it actually came from St. Stephen's Cathedral and was reused. You can see that that's what they did with the tympanum above the central portal was decorated by sculptures in the Romanesque era. Above the 3 portals, you have the Gallery of Kings with the 28 kings of Judah, which were originally painted, as were all the other sculptures on this facade. Above that, the balcony of the Virgin, referring to the statue of the Virgin and Child. And above that, the Grande Galerie, where the columns are located. And then the towers. They were originally planned to have spires, and the spires might have looked like the one on the right here, which is at Chartres Cathedral, and it was built around the same time. In the end, the towers were never built. And the south tower, the Tour des Ribaud, was completed first in 1240. It houses a belfry for the 2 great bells known as the Grand et Petit Bourdon. And the north tower, called the Tour Guillaume, was completed 10 years later, and it houses a belfry for 8 smaller bells. A bell in French is une cloche, and many of you may be familiar with the word un clochard, who were famously supposed to sleep under bridges. It's defined in modern times as a vagrant or a homeless person living on the street, what in French is now called these days a sans domicile fixe. But in the Middle Ages, a clochard referred to the beggars who were hired to ring the bells of Notre-Dame, and they were paid in wine. You'll recall that the South Tower is called the Tour des Ribaud, and Ribaud means the ribald types, which is another reference to the clochard, who were a ribald lot after they consumed the wine, after ringing the bells. And that is Quasimodo ringing the bell of Notre Dame on the left. So here, the western facade of Notre Dame is in the high Gothic style. It's rather austere, and you can see by comparison the west facade of Notre Dame de Reims in the rayonnant Gothic style, much more exuberant decoration. Something remarkable happened in 1220. The entire upper portion of Notre Dame was rebuilt in the high Gothic style, reducing the number of stories from 4 to 3 and allowing larger windows to be built. This is an example of a 3-story elevation of Notre Dame. And you can see on the right, they have suppressed the triforium. So you now have the arcade, and above that, the tribune, and above that, the clerestory. And this allowed for larger windows to be built in the clerestory, letting in more light. And here on the right, you see the old windows that used to be there before the renovation. And you have a much smaller window at the top and an oculus, a round window below it that opened onto a dark space underneath a pitched roof. So it let in no light. And on the left, you have the one of the 37 new larger windows composed of 2 lancets with a rose above it. The roof was raised as well, somewhat above the throughout above the nave and the choir, but there were still 6-part rib vaults leading to identical cylindrical columns of the nave, avoiding the problem with sexpartite vaults with weak and strong pillars. There still are quadripartite vaults, however, in the double ambulatory around the nave and choir, and a quadripartite vault above the transept, sexpartite on either side, and then quadripartite next to the rose windows. This is a wonderful image which bears a little bit of study. On the right-hand side, you see the the old 4-story clerestory with the pitched roof that covers the oculus. You see the smaller windows on the right and the pitched roof below it. And on the left side, you see the 3-story elevation, slightly higher roof. And you can see the much larger window with the flat roof below it. Believe it or not, the entire cathedral was redone in that new style, creating these new much larger windows. So the high, thin walls were supported by 28 flying buttresses, arc-boutants. Originally, they were double flying buttresses with 2 piers, but ultimately they were replaced by larger single arches. Some of them were very long, 48-foot long arches around the chevet with pinnacles added on top for more weight to counter the outward pressure. Once the church was fundamentally built, the decision was made to put chapels between the pillars, not the pillars, the piers, where the flying buttresses were on the outside. So there were 7 on each side of the nave. And then the next move was to extend the transepts beyond the outer wall of the nave chapels, which meant that the transepts, the facades, had to be entirely rebuilt. Here's the north transept in the early Gothic style. And here's the new transept that was built in the new rayonnant style by the architect Jean de Chelles. The north transept was built first, the Portail du Cloître, with its magnificent rose window in the Rayonnant Gothic style. And you can see why it's called Rayonnant, because of the radiating spokes coming from the center of the rose window. And it sits above 18 lancet windows, and it's the only rose window in Notre Dame with its original glass. The south, and right next to it is a small red door, which permitted the canon, the chanoine, to pass directly from the cloister to the choir when the church was under construction. The nave, in particular, red was the color for women in the Middle Ages, which changed to blue during the Renaissance. The south transept was similarly extended and rebuilt also in the Rayonnant style 10 years later by the architects Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreuil. The south rose window, the midday rose in the also Rayonnant Gothic style, depicts the Last Judgment, but it is not the original window. It was rebuilt in the 18th century and restored in the 19th. And the third rose window is the west rose window, the smallest and the oldest in the original wheel style behind. It's been hidden behind the organ since 1730, and it has no original glass. The spire was built above the transept crossing around the same time as the new transept facades were built. And then chapels were built between the piers around the choir to more or less finish the job. But inside, a sculpted stone rood screen, a jubé en français, was built around the choir around 1230. And the sides, this is the front of the rood screen, as you can see, separating literally the choir from the transept. And behind on the sides, there was also an enclosure with these magnificent carved reliefs. And that concludes the discussion of the construction of Notre Dame. I commend to you these amazing videos which show you in 10 minutes and 4 minutes what I just showed you in a half an hour. It's very entertaining, well worth doing. And I believe it was done for the Friends of Notre-Dame de Paris. So once constructed, Notre Dame dominated the Paris skyline for the next 300 years. And when finally the Dome Church of the Invalides was built, it was so far away you couldn't see it. So Notre Dame really was the epicenter of Paris, as signified by the Point Zéro des Routes de France marker that was embedded in the parvis only 100 years ago. But happily, it was removed during the restoration work, but it was reinstalled earlier this year. So what's happened in the next centuries? Not much on the architectural front, but it was by far the most important structure in Christendom, or certainly in Paris, for the next hundreds of years. So 1238, Louis IX purchased his relics from the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, and delivered them to Notre Dame for storage pending the construction of the Notre Dame of the Sainte-Chapelle. Philippe IV held the first Estates General in Notre Dame because of course, the biggest building in Paris, where the three estates, the clergy, the aristocracy, and the commoners met to consult on some major political issue. You can see that Paris was very, very crowded. This is just the Ile de la Cité. The entire city was surrounded by a wall in 1200 by the Philippe Auguste wall, and it remained surrounded by walls. So everything inside the wall was full, and only when it overflowed did they build new walls further and further out. Henry VI, at age 10, already King of England, was crowned King of France. He never really was able to be King of France. This is during the Hundred Years' War, but he was crowned in Notre-Dame. Sixteenth century was a century of terrible religious tumult, mainly caused by the Reformation. And in France, and certainly Paris, there was no church building during this time. Reformation started when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Church in 1517, started the spread of Protestantism, which reached France, peaking in 1572, where there were over 2 million Protestants in France. And this resulted in 8 different wars of religion in the 16th century. They would be war, a peace, a war, a peace. And the third war ended in 1570. And that was a break in the action, which permitted the Huguenot Henry III, King of Navarre, to marry the Catholic daughter of Henry II, King Henry II, Marguerite de Valois, on August 18th, 1572. They were actually married in Notre-Dame, where she went in. Henri waited outside because he was not Catholic. St. Bartholomew's Day massacre followed 6 days later, staggeringly, when Catholics, since all the Huguenots were in Paris to celebrate the wedding, as one way to end this series of wars once and for all, so thought Catherine de Medicis, was to murder the Coligny, the leader of the Huguenots, and so many of his followers. That, of course, started the Fourth War, which went on through the Eighth War. And then finally, instead of a war of religion, there was a war against the new King of France, the very same Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot King of Navarre, through a series of 3 deaths of 3 brothers without issue. He became King of France because he was next in line in 1589, resisted by the Catholic League. So it wasn't a war of religion per se, but it might as well have been, until finally Henri converted to Catholicism in 1593 and entered Paris. He signed the Edict of Nantes in 1593, granting religious and civil rights to Huguenots and effectively ending the wars of religion, in which as many as 4 million Huguenots and Catholics died. Henry IV, but the wars were not over, to be sure. Henry IV was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic in 1610, who suffered the fate of anyone who messes with the king, which was he was drawn and quartered on the parvis de l'Hôtel de Ville, which is only 500 meters away from Notre-Dame, on the left bank or the right bank of Paris, which was called La Ville, because that is where commerce took place. The left bank was called l'Université because that's where the University of Paris was located. Louis XIII, Henri IV's son, during his reign, Paris was elevated to an archdiocese, and Louis XIII was much under the influence of his mother, Marie de Medici, who was very Catholic, and he reasserted Catholicism, and there was a surge of church building as a result of the Counter-Reformation, which began with the Council of Trent. What are we going to do to counter this Protestant Reformation? And the Council of Trent encouraged church building, abolished rood screens. It was no longer necessary for churches to face east. His son, Louis XIV, ended religious tolerance once, which had been in decline ever since Louis XIII, by revoking the Edict of Nantes in 1685. And Catholicism, forget toleration, once again became the state religion. During the reign of both Louis XIII and XIV, the corporation or guild of the smart goldsmiths every May 1st for nearly 80 years gave a large format painting to Notre-Dame depicting Acts of the Apostles. This is the one they gave in 1634, 35, 37, 39. And these 73 Mays were hung from the pillars in the nave during the 17th century, and they were moved to above the arches in the 18th century. Also in the 17th century, 14 tapestries were hung from the walls of the choir. In 1681, the Grand Bourdon, the largest of the bells of Notre Dame, weighing 13 tons, was hung in the South Tower, where it still hangs today. Much happened in the 18th century. Not much had happened but between the 14th century until then in terms of the structure of the church, but the interior was dramatically decorated. An organ was installed, as I will now show you. So the sanctuary and choir were remodeled in the Baroque style under Louis XIV. The rood screen that had been there since the 13th century was demolished in 1699. And that was part of the idea of the Council of Trent, because up until then, the rood screen had separated the congregation from the clerics. So now, for the first time, the congregation could actually see what was going on in the choir. This is not what the rood screen looked like at Notre Dame, but this is the only surviving rood screen in Paris at the wonderful Église Saint-Étienne du Mont, right behind the Pantheon. The magnificent new high altar and sculptures were designed. And the great organ was installed. It's the largest organ in France with 8,000 pipes. And the 14 tapestries were all sold to the Strasbourg Cathedral. Perhaps most dramatically, in the mid-18th century, not long before the Revolution, 50 years before the Revolution, all of the medieval glass windows were replaced with clear windows, and the walls of Notre Dame were whitewashed because the clerics at the time wanted Notre Dame to be even whiter, brighter. Only the rose windows were spared. The architect Germain Soufflot removed the center pillar from the central portal of the west facade to facilitate passage of major processions. The original spire was in a bad state and had to be removed and was never replaced, or at least not right away, because of the Revolution. And during the Revolution, all churches were closed, all church property was confiscated, and there was a period of 10 years of de-Christianization of France. where the Catholic religion was replaced by the cult of reason. And Notre-Dame and other churches were transformed into temples of reason. The commune that governed Paris during the Revolution, or France, uh, ordered the destruction of the statues of the kings in the gallery of Notre-Dame, and also the statues next to the three portals of Notre-Dame. So here you have the vacant spaces where the statues once stood. During the Revolution, 80% of the church bells, including 20 bells of Notre-Dame, were melted down to make cannons or munitions for the Revolutionary War. The revolution finally was brought to an end when Napoleon Bonaparte seized power as the first consul in 1799. And 2 years later, he signed the Concordat of 1801, whereby he returned control of the churches to the church, the Catholic Church, but not ownership. They could occupy, but they did not own.
Russell, sorry,
Yes,
please excuse the interruption. I just wanted to let you know we have about 5 minutes left.
okay. I might run over. Okay. So Napoleon entered Notre Dame, but he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame, famously crowning himself and not the Pope, while the Pope Pius VII sat behind watching. Notre Dame was in terrible shape after the Revolution. Restoration movement started in 1830, but Notre Dame was left out. 1831, Victor Hugo wrote his novel Notre-Dame de Paris in English, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which drew attention to the cathedral's plight and resulted in the restoration of Notre Dame by the architects Jean-Baptiste Lassus, who died young, and was his colleague Eugène Viollet-le-Duc finished the job, considered to be the first restoration architect. When he arrived, there were no kings in the gallery, no statues between the portals, no trumeau in the center portal, no spire, no pinnacles. The gargoyles were corroded. So Viollet-le-Duc installed pinnacles on the nave and choir, built a new sacristy, built a new spire, but he didn't build the new spire in the same way as the old one. He was inspired by the last of the Gothic spires that was built in Amiens Cathedral in the 16th century. So the spire that burned was not the original one. He installed 16 statues at the base, including one with his face on it. When he replaced the statues, but he didn't know exactly what they looked like, so he was inspired by the statues on the cathedrals at Amiens, Laon, Chartres, and Reims. Wonderful, intricate ironwork on the central portal. 14th century statue of the Virgin and Child installed on the southeast portal of the transept crossing. Of the 73 maize that were sold during the Revolution, 51 were located, 20 were returned to Notre Dame, and 13 were installed in the side chapels by Viollet-le-Duc, who in his research discovered that there had been on the right, the old transept windows with the oculus and the small window, and he restored those by way of recognizing the original early Gothic style just around the transept. He replaced the gargoyles. He built new had sculpted new chimera. He built new wooden belfries inside the north and south towers to support the bells. Napoleon III did not crown himself emperor in Notre-Dame, but he did baptize his only son in Notre-Dame, and for that occasion he gave 4 bells that were installed in the North Tower. So here you have the Notre-Dame of Viollet-le-Duc with the new spire, new statues, new trumeaux, new pinnacles, new chimera, new gargoyles, new belfries and bells, new stained glass windows in the medieval style. Before and after. Before and after. Finally, Notre Dame was added to the list of historic monuments in 1862. The area around Notre Dame was redesigned just after the cathedral itself. Here you have the very small parvis in front of Notre Dame. Before Osman demolished everything between the outside red lines, and replaced them with 3 structures: Hôtel Dieu, Préfecture de Police, Tribunal de Commerce. The original parvis the word parvis comes from the Latin word paradisus, or paradise, because that's what people would feel when they wound their way through the medieval streets and they were confronted by this amazing facade of Notre Dame. The parvis originally was surrounded by an enclosure. But our friend Osman liked big open spaces in front of major monuments. And there was this large old version of the Hôtel Dieu that blocked the view of Notre Dame. So he demolished it. This is looking the other way. Before, the view after. This is from a wonderful shot taken from the Tour Saint-Jacques, looking towards Notre Dame, and you can see all the buildings between it and the parvis, which were demolished and replaced by the Hôtel Dieu, the hospital. This is the new Hôtel Dieu overlooking the new parvis Notre-Dame. And on the west end of the parvis, he built the Caserne de la Cité, called now the Préfecture de Police. And this parvis is 4 times larger than the one that preceded it. You can see today, or no longer, but actually you can still see the top part where the arrow is, the outline of the Rue Neuve de Notre-Dame. On the left, it's the cathedral. I'm sorry, it's the Hôtel Dieu, the old Hôtel Dieu. But unfortunately, these markings will likely disappear in the redesign of the parvis. The Ile de la Cité before Haussmann and after, with the much larger parvis Notre-Dame. Okay, I realize that I'm running over. I will race through the next 5 minutes, and I beg your tolerance. 20th century, the law of separation of church and state. Cathedrals remain the property of the state, and the Cathedral of Notre Dame is owned by the French state, and as are all other cathedrals in France. World War I was fought mainly on the borders with Belgium and Germany and Luxembourg. But Big Bertha, this huge gun, could reach Paris from 75 miles away. And you can see these blue dots where shells landed in Paris. One of them landed on the Église Saint-Gervais et Saint-Protais behind the Hôtel de Ville, at a service on Good Friday, causing the roof to collapse, killing 91, wounding 68. Only 500 meters from Notre Dame, but Notre Dame was not damaged. World War II, Germans occupied Paris. Notre Dame was not damaged. In the liberation of Paris, the Allies arrived. De Gaulle walked from the Arc de Triomphe to Notre Dame, where a special mass was celebrated. 1950s, the Parvis is now becoming to look a little bit more like a parking lot. 60s, it's getting pretty dingy. The Rue d'Arcole went right in front of Notre Dame. The 60s, parking lots were built under all the squares, in virtually all the big squares, place in Paris, including Notre Dame. And when they started digging, they, of course, discovered Gallo-Roman ruins, which ultimately slowed the process and ended up in the construction, the opening of the archaeological crypt with vestiges of Gallo-Roman era. The decapitated statues, well, their heads, or 20 of them, out of the 28 were discovered and are now on display at the Cluny Museum. A lot of renovation works took place during the 20th century for Notre Dame as well. Probably the most important one is the cleaning of Notre Dame, the ravalement of the exterior of Notre Dame, which was filthy. André Malraux put in a new law which resulted in the cleaning of historic monuments and also private dwellings. And here he is in front of a spanking clean Notre Dame. 12 abstract stained glass windows replaced the glass windows in 1966. Notre Dame was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A second ravalement of the west facade in 2000. The centennial was celebrated by 850th anniversary of the laying of the first stone was celebrated in 2013 with new bells, 8 new bells, Marie, and 8 new bells, smaller bells called Benjamin. Marie was mounted in the south tower next to Emmanuel, and the Benjamin were mounted in the north tower. And you can, if you go in there inside, you will see a small hole next to in the tower through which the bells were raised in the ceiling of the vault. Major restoration campaign begun in 2018, partially funded by the Friends of Notre-Dame de Paris. They were going to restore a lot of the exterior, which is in terrible shape. In order to restore the spire, they installed scaffolding in 2019 and removed the 16 bronze statues that Viollet-le-Duc had installed. And just days later, the fire was discovered at 6:45 p.m. It started at the base of the spire, it spread up the spire, and then it spread up the length of the nave and the choir and the transept. Why there? Because everything below the roof, lead roof, was made out of 1,200 whole oak trees, 800 years old, very dry. It is called the forest because there are so many trees there. And it all went up in flames. Spire collapsed at 7:30. The heat melted the pipes in the scaffolding. crown of thorns was saved. There was a threat that the fire would spread to the wooden belfry that supported the 8 bells in the North Tower. Fortunately, it was saved by the intervention of brave firemen and women. Fire was put out by mid-morning. Notre-Dame with its roof and spire and without, before and after. For what happens next, please tune in next week for the presentation by Philippe de Villeneuve, architect en chef, responsible for the restoration period en français, moderated by Michel Picot, who is the founder and president of the Friends of Notre-Dame de Paris. Merci beaucoup, and sorry for being too long.
Russell, what can I say? We can forgive you for the length of time because it was an extraordinary presentation. Everyone, and look at, they're all coming up and sending applause. People who live in Paris are saying they have learned things they never knew. It has been enlightening, engrossing, and just a very, very special moment for all of us today. So we thank you. Merci infiniment. I do want to thank mille fois our Federation of the Alliance Française and our partners who all came together, and to all of you who stayed the course, who have been sending in your questions and all that. I'm afraid we can't get to those today, but merci infiniment for joining us. Russell has already mentioned the next lecture next week, so I won't go into that. I do want to have you note that Philippe's presentation and the following question and after session moderated by Michel Picot will be in French. So there will be an option for every viewer to have subtitles in French or in simultaneous English translation. I really know I have to let you go, so au revoir et à bientôt.